In 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And welcome everyone to this episode of the Real Leaders Podcast. Welcome everyone to this episode of the Real Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Edwards. Joining us today is Sheila Stafford, the founder and CEO of TeamSense. Sheila, thanks for being with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So Sheila, love the backdrop. Tell me the story about the pinball machine behind you.
Yeah. So, growing up, my parents were not ones to just give us anything that we wanted as a kid. And, it was really instilled in us that if we wanted something, we had to earn it. And so one of my things as a kid was like constantly trying to figure out how I could always earn money. And I was really fortunate to grow up in a place that afforded an opportunity for a kid to earn some money. And that was really close to where the Buffalo Bills play. At the time, it was called Rich Stadium. Now I think it's like Highmark Stadium or something like that. But in the state of New York, they have a deposit on cans. And so when you turn in cans, you can get a nickel a piece. And so I developed a little business there on recycling cans. And I started off with just, running around with a couple bags. And there happened to be a 7-Eleven right across the street. And so I'd pick up some, bags of cans and I'd take it over to 7-Eleven and quickly turn that in for cash and go in and do it again. But then I got smarter and thought like there had to be a more efficient way to make some money. And so my neighbor was throwing out this old refrigerator box. And so I grabbed the box, and my dad was always pretty handy and had all kinds of, little materials laying around. And so I fashioned a trailer connected to this box to my bicycle. And I wrote, cans on the box, and I took it down to the stadium, and I left the big giant box, near the door. Obviously you can't take cans in. And I would go around and kind of had a little, round robin trip to fill up this box of cans, drive it directly across the street to 7-Eleven, in which they hated me every time they saw me coming because they knew I had all these dirty cans that I was turning in, turned that into cash. And at 8, 9 years old, acquired that sweet pinball machine that's now since followed me around since being a child.
Well, we know there's no shortage of cans at the Buffalo
No shortage
Bills
of cans.
Right. What was it about that experience? What were some of the tangible business skills that you learned, at a young age that you can still apply today?
Yeah, it's so funny. It's just constantly looking at like what environment you're in and how to be more efficient, right? So looking at the process, understanding like, okay, what are the basic mechanics of how this like little business works? And then how do you continually evolve and make it more efficient? Over time, I actually invited my neighbor saw that I was making so much money. And so other neighborhood kids would come, and then my sister came. And so we ended up having this little, operation. I didn't think ahead of time that I should be skimming off the top from, from my sister or the neighbors. But, nowadays I would have been like, hey, wait a minute, I could have had a nice pyramid scheme going. But I was really fortunate. Like my dad is a bit of an entrepreneur himself. He runs an electrical business. He's an electrician. He worked at a factory for part-time, and then he would come home, change out of his factory clothes, then go ahead and do electrical work for, homes and contractors and things like that. And, just in general, like it runs in my family. I would say the other thing that I got from my dad is really, in addition to just figuring out how to continue to evolve your business, but negotiation skills. One of the elements that we had growing up was my dad was really good at fixing mechanical things. Again, I mentioned we had all kinds of little parts and mechanical items to make things around the house. And one time he and I worked on the snowmobile that we were going to fix. And so we worked on it together and got it up and running. And my dad put it up for sale. And he said, listen, Sheila, like I know that we've helped out, and I think, you should get part of the profits from the sale. But when they come to buy it, you're going to have to negotiate the sales price. And so I was like, okay. And he's like, we've got about, $350 in cost and in labor and what we need to get out of it. And so anything that you can negotiate, greater than $350, we'll split 50-50. And so, this guy shows up to buy this snowmobile, and my dad steps back, and, the guy like goes to offer a price, and he's like, no, you gotta negotiate with the kid. And the guy, just like looks at me like, he's like, hey, it's hers, you need to negotiate with her. And so like really these little lessons early on help prepare me for, life in the business world and eventually, the seat that I have today.
So what'd you sell it for?
I don't remember. It was like $500. Like it was a decent profit where like the light bulb goes off where, constantly you're like, oh, there's a better way, a faster way to make more money. Like I made more money fixing the snowmobile than I could collect in cans all season. And so there's just these little like lessons throughout that helped me continue to evolve that process and continue to figure out how to get more efficient and smarter with your time and energy and effort.
Wow. So at a young age, we've learned supply and demand. We've learned negotiation. We learned profit margins.
Right.
Another part of that is you're a social entrepreneur as well, starting out, recycling, right? We love it. It helps the environment out as well. So let's continue on that path, Sheila.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's go to college. Let's go to university. You still had the business spirit. What did you do then?
I did. Yeah. So, I was really fortunate to go and play lacrosse in college. So I went and played at Duke University on the women's lacrosse team. And while there, I studied mechanical engineering. I had this idea that, I was really good at math and science. And, again, like from my dad, like had taught me that like, hey, he was like, you better go to college because, you don't want to be digging trenches for the rest of your life, which is a job that I did in the summer for his electrical business. And so leveraging, my prowess in high school math and science, I was like, yes, I'm going to go be a mechanical engineer. And so I went to Duke to study mechanical engineering, really got into that, while playing lacrosse. And of course, coming out at the time I graduated, if you were a fantastic engineer, like one of the places you got hired in was, the big three. So, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler out of Detroit, Michigan. And so I set my sights on working for one of the big three, graduated and joined as a mechanical engineer working in the factories with General Motors. And so my very first instance out of university was really trying to figure out how to help the factories produce the next models. And so when a new model comes in, you have to go into the factory and you have to understand, what needs to change in order to produce the next model. And so my role of an engineer, when I thought was, more of like a product, like, hey, I'm going to invent like the newest, greatest things that people want, was really, really kind of narrowing in on like, how do I make this next model? How do we produce this? What needs to change? And so my kind of idea of what an engineer was versus the reality kind of set in those first couple of years, and was like, maybe this isn't right for me. And so I ended up spending, 3 years, learned a lot in manufacturing, learned a lot about how the operations work, which actually, comes back later in the story to today. Our TeamSense serves, really large scale manufacturing companies. And so a lot of those lessons learned then apply today. But at that moment, I was like, I don't think that, this role as an engineer is right for me. And so I decided to take a step back and shift my career and go into marketing, kind of product development. And so my big stepping stone in order to make a career shift was going back to business school.
And then from business, then is this what led you to Whirlpool after that?
Yeah. So I went back to business school, and actually, I found business school, and I don't know if it's, I think back quite frequently on it. Actually, I found business school to be much less intense than engineering school at Duke. And I debate whether that's because, I wasn't playing a Division I sport, while trying to study, or was just kind of like really finding my groove of like, hey, these are my people. But while at University of Notre Dame, where I got my MBA, I actually started a business because, I didn't want to just do my work or like go out and party. I was like, hey, like, why don't we get something done? And I had some extra time on my hands. And so we actually started a business and won the Notre Dame business plan competition. And the irony of the whole thing was the business was a social enterprise, also recycling, but in this case, recycling unused medical supplies from kits that are used in surgery. And so our goal was to take these unused medical supplies from, surgical kits and put them into more like generic, we'll say, organizations. So instead of, the specific type of gauze or the specific type of sutures, you just put them into, sutures or gauze, and then look to move those goods abroad to what we'd call like second tier nations. And so got that business up and running. We had the angel funding, and I was doing that kind of on the side of the of business school. And then, eventually graduated, still had the business, and came to the really fast realization that I needed to pay back my student loans from graduate school, and the income from a startup wasn't going to help me do that. And so Whirlpool Corporation is about an hour north of where University of Notre Dame is. And they invited me to come in to a marketing rotational program. And so at the time, I thought like, hey, I've been doing school full time and running this business full time. Like, I absolutely can continue to run this business and, join Whirlpool, but had that hard reality of, what the business would actually take to get up and running and what a full-time job at, a Fortune 500 actually takes to excel, and ended up having to close the business and devote, 110% of my time towards my career at Whirlpool.
So Sheila, before we go into Whirlpool, just for the, I'd say our average audience, is around 28 to 34, 35 to 44. Like that's our bell curve of our audience listeners. So these are some of these people, have reached out and they are interested in going back to business school. But kind of have those questions. What did you learn? What did you take away from business school? And if you were going to do it over again, would you go back?
Oh yeah, I would go back. I think, business school really gives you that ability to do a step function change in your career. And so without having gone back to business school, I don't think I could have, successfully landed a career in kind of product development and marketing space from having just a straight engineering background.
Right. Okay.
I think on top of just, career switching, which it's pretty common to do so in business school, the networks that you make, and everybody always asks, like, what would you do differently? I would take more finance classes. And like, the funny part is everybody told me this and I didn't listen. And now I'm the same one saying the same exact thing, right? Like, finance is the universal language of business, across the globe. And so the better that you understand, impacts to, the P&L and the balance sheet and how all those play together, like just the more intelligent you'll be, and you'll be up to speed on the language fluency that needed to run the business moving on.
And that's interesting that you say that, because it seems like when you were in Notre Dame and you had this idea to provide these gauze kits and these medical services to underserved countries, maybe it was difficult, or maybe you didn't have the expertise to look at the business valuation or the actual logistics of what that would cost to get, that kit to that country.
Yeah.
What would be the margin? So maybe walk us through that revelation of, hey, I'm going to maybe give up on my side hustle right now to go pay off my bills. Like, what was it that really got you to understand that this is going to be a very difficult business to get off the ground?
Yeah, well, we had early success. Like, we won the Notre Dame business plan competition. And what we thought was kind of the crux of the business was like, are hospitals really going to give us this stuff, right? Like, for sure they're throwing it out, but are they really going to let us come in there and take it? And then that the demand for medical supplies, around the globe is super high. And so in our kind of basic estimate, we're like, all right, we know that the demand will be there. Like, can we really get the supply? And the supply thing would be, the biggest nut to crack in the business. And when we got into it, it turned out to be the exact opposite, right? Like, the hospitals were like, here, take it, like, get it off our hands, because they're paying to dispose of it. And so they saw us as a way that was just like a cost reduction that literally cost them nothing. They could get a great benefit from it and, talk about it socially. And then we had all of the supplies coming in, but then kind of like figuring out how to get those supplies abroad was much, much more difficult than what we had anticipated. In order to make it efficient, you had to send in these large containers. You can't just send a UPS box, of gauze to, one of these countries. And so in order to make it efficient, they had to order an entire, container full at a time. At the time that we started the business was during the, economic meltdown, 2008, 2009. And so if you look at just a percentage of funds that they would need to spend to get an entire container full of materials, it would represent, 75 to 90% of their annual budget for the entire hospital. And so now all of a sudden you're asking this, individual hospital, which they're not well networked in these countries. And so like in the US, we're very used to like buying groups and like large networks of hospitals. They're individual hospitals buying kind of among themselves, not networked really well, to then spend, 90% of all the money that they have for the year with you on one shipment, a company that has no name, that just came out of nowhere. They're like, yeah, no. And so
Yeah,
like actually
exactly.
like meeting that was really, really tough. And just that message of like how important cash flow is, right? Which you hear a lot in business school of like, yeah, cash is king. And like you hear now, even in when you listen to earnings release, you know, they're always talking about the cash flow and the cash generation, and like feeling that like personally of like, oh, like, man, we can't continue. You know, we've got all the operations and we still need to pay everyone to keep these up and running. And so that realization came in and was like, okay, well then I can't get paid. And I knew, you know, at the time, like if I went and talked to, you know, investors and folks were interested in investing in the business and really helping us make it a go, but they wanted, you know, me as the leader, understandably, to be there 100%. And
Right.
so, you know, just doing the math of like, okay, I can be there 100%, we can keep the business going, but then I can't take out a salary that will help me pay off my, you know, student loans at Notre Dame. It just became obvious that it just was not the right time for me to be leading a startup. And I needed to kind of, you know, take care of business on the home front and make sure that I didn't fall behind on my student loans when I had a great opportunity in front of me for Whirlpool.
Well, Sheila, I think it's really important that we touch on all of these because,
Yeah.
you know, for people listening, I think, you know, they're going to understand how well-rounded, you know, a bit of a business leader that you are.
Yeah.
I want to make sure we touch on kind of where these experiences come from.
Sure.
So you start off with entrepreneurship, you know, at an early age, negotiation with your father, right? You go into engineering and operations at an automobile organization. You have this startup launch, so you're kind of understanding how to take something off the ground, how to find ways to sell your product. What are the margins? What are you going to run into? You experience failure, and maybe you say, how am I actually going to bring in cash for myself to pay off these student loans that I have? And then you go into marketing and sales in Whirlpool. Now we're here. Tell us what you learned. What were some of the experiences that you had, especially overseas?
Yeah. A couple like just really marquee experiences. So I joined Whirlpool in a leadership development program that allowed me to rotate through different facets. And I would say there's two kind of really, or maybe three, really defining moments for me, you know, as I kind of view myself as growing up within Whirlpool Corporation. And for those of you that don't know, Whirlpool owns Whirlpool, KitchenAid, Maytag, Genair, Amana brands. We also made Kenmore at the time. And so I joined Whirlpool, and, you know, one of my early roles was being the product manager for dishwashers, right? And so dishwashers as a product, you know, you start off with opening price point is, you know, $299 for a dishwasher for like an Amana brand. And then that same exact functional product, like it still washes dishes, still, you know, does it in roughly the same amount of time, you sell on your KitchenAid brand at your high end at, you know, nearly $3,000 a piece, right? So you've got this span of $300 to $3,000 for the same exact functional product.
Right.
And as a product manager, you're like, okay, like, how do you do that, right? And like, how do you get people to buy, you know, the same thing at such drastic different pricing? And so that's really where I learned about, you know, like product innovation and like what drives people, and particularly like what drives people across brands. But, you know, in the context of Whirlpool, like the brands and like the differences are so nuanced because it's the same product, again, you know, coming off the same line, but yet at the same time could drive like so much value. And so like, what a great opportunity, you know, like we're doing customer research and looking at, you know, how do we bring innovations? And then in particular, like what do things people at the low end like really, really care about? But they don't care at all about the high end. But then those high end folks really, really care about those things, right? And so like once you can define these kind of anchoring points, you can say like, okay, like the low end doesn't give a crap about that on the high end, but the high end people must really, really like that. And so you could start anchoring and then building your line around it. And so it really caused me to like pay a lot closer attention to, you know, the way customers talk about things, the way people talk about the products in their home. And so I use that, you know, as an example of just really honing in kind of, you know, customer listening and product development. And so the other opportunity that kind of sprang, you know, out of Whirlpool was, you know, they decided to create a group. It's now called WLabs. At the time, it wasn't named that, but you guys can look it up, which is basically innovations. And so Whirlpool, if you think about their core competencies and, you know, refrigeration and dishwashing and laundry, they have incredible, market penetration. Like you're not going to find a new country where people aren't using, refrigerators, right? And so every day what they're fighting over is, the little bit of market share for folks that are either, upgrading their appliances or they've otherwise died. And so Whirlpool has an incentive to create new categories, right? So how do you kind of, create new products that are completely blue ocean? And so they created this WLabs group, which is a group that's meant to go out there and find new products for them to, innovate and kind of continue to add value in the homes. And so one of the leaders at Whirlpool had known, he was in kind of similar venture circles as I was when I started the business at Notre Dame, had known that I had this experience. And so when they're looking for like employee number one, he's like, hey, I know, Sheila Stafford, did this thing and she's got some experience with VC. Like, why don't we get her in and be kind of employee number one? And we want to kind of operate very similar to like an internal VC. And so, they brought me in there and my directive was like, we want to build something that like our customers give us permission to play with our brands that fits our core competency, but that doesn't exist in the world today. Ready, go. I was like, okay. And so, I first started really looking at trends and understanding, what was going on in the macro environment, looking at, what are really Whirlpool's core competencies, like where's our portfolio of IP and R&D, looking at where the customers will allow the brands to play. And at that time I had, full leverage across all of the brands, right? So not just Whirlpool, but KitchenAid, Amana, Jenn-Air, wherever, like where else could we play? And so one of the ideas that I came up with that eventually, spawned into a product was an indoor home composter. Now, this was back in 2011, 2012. And so there's a bunch now, we'll say, out in the market, but this was pretty early on. And so my first kind of foray was developing a business case and then pitching the CEO of Whirlpool on why we should invest in building an indoor home composter. And so lucky for me, they decided to invest. And the first investment was really small and just like conducting research and kind of proving out that this business is worthwhile of further investment. And so we kind of went through these little stage gates where each time they would trickle a little bit more funds until eventually, we actually got like a big slug of funds and they're like, okay, let's go build it. This project turned into, a joint venture with Procter & Gamble. Procter & Gamble came on board to help us, manage the odor of the composting process, and Whirlpool was going to create the machine. And we had this JV set up and I was leading the project. I would come in every day and like, it was just so invigorating. Like I love just opening the door of this lab and we literally had like 70 people like all there, like working on a product that one, benefits the environment, two, is like brand new innovation, and three, like what was so like exciting for me was like they all had like a meaningful job and work to do because I had an idea and because I could pull together that idea and pitch the CEO and convince somebody that they should fund us. And so I had the opportunity of kind of raising this new product. We named it Zara from scratch. And so we kind of marched that forward. And unfortunately, it got caught up in a little bit of an issue with that joint venture. So Whirlpool and Procter & Gamble decided to dissolve that joint venture, which then sent Whirlpool a little bit into a tailspin on, how are we going to manage the odor? Like we don't have any supply chain. We don't have any expertise in, odor management. And so they then had an option. Do we, take on the odor management portion ourselves and figure out a way to solve that? Or do we kind of scrap the program? Because everybody knows that there's no way you're going to have a home composter in your home if you can't manage the odor, right? That's problem number one and super, super obvious. And so at that moment, they came to me and they said, listen, like, I know that you've kind of brought this up from scratch, but like, we're at this point where like the product's not going to launch for some time because now we have to go back and redo all of that, odor management stuff on our own. And so you can continue to stay in this role and continue to kind of, lead your baby, or we've got this great opportunity for you to move abroad and help us with an integration. And so, I was faced with this decision of like, oh man, like I literally built this up from scratch. Like, yeah, this is a setback. I was confident that we could figure it out and everybody was invigorated. But at the same time, like just standing still for, 18 months to 2 years in my career as we waited to kind of pick up the steam on that side was also, not ideal, right? Like I'm young and I want to continue to progress. And so I had a really great mentor, and had lots of, long discussions with like, okay, like what should I do? Like how should I, look at this decision? And so in the end, I decided that I would take the move abroad. And so my family and I were asked to move to northern Italy, so not a bad assignment abroad, and help Whirlpool with an integration. They had bought an appliance manufacturer in Italy called Indesit. And at the time, it was the largest acquisition that Whirlpool's ever made. They paid over $1 billion for this company. And if you look at just the Whirlpool European business, Whirlpool Europe and Indesit were equals. And so it was basically like an acquisition or a merger of equals in Italy that I went over to help out with.
So Sheila, let's pause there
Yeah.
for a little bit and just kind of hone in on what you just covered. This to me is like entrepreneurship. It's a large organization spotting someone in the company and saying, okay, we either want to disrupt ourselves, or we want to have someone that's young and needs the experience, that's going to grow and is going to take on a new initiative. Now, I think this is the beauty of capitalism, right? They have a concept. We want to create something new, something that's going to be in the home and is going to solve a problem. You come in, you get the funding, you're able to go in on a day. Partnerships are coming in to eliminate the odors. And what's also the beauty of capitalism, you run into things along the way. And maybe sometimes you're too early in this process. I know we talked about this earlier, and we used to have a compost bin. And the problem, the smell. Where'd we keep the compost bin? Outside. How annoying was that for me to not put the coffee grinds in the trash can and put it in the compost? Very annoying. So, it is a very interesting concept. I'm sure we'll see it happen in years to come. The question I have for you with this customer experience, let's see, customer X here, is how do you distinguish a need from a want? The reason I say this is with your cans example, in the very beginning, that was a need. People need to throw cans, not on the street, but in some place. So it was a need. With the medical kits, it was also like a feel good for the hospitals, but also a need for someone else. But how do you distinguish a need from a want during that research, and where something is actually going to be a viable product or service?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And we did a lot of user research and had some hypotheses on like, and that's actually like the way that you talk about it is interesting, a need from a want. And so what you want to do is you really want to hone in on what your hypotheses are of somebody who feels the need to have a home composter, what might be different about them than somebody who has a want. And so in this particular, for the home composter, we had this hypothesis that this person is, incredibly eco-friendly. This person is looking at, the impact to climate and, what the negative impact is, for their family and how that kind of creates a legacy, and what other things that they might have purchased, right? So at the time, Tesla was not around, at least to the extent that it was today. Maybe if you were, ultra wealthy and you could have one of those cool like X-Wing cars. But other than that, it wasn't, as prevalent as we see today. And so, honing in on folks who had hybrid vehicles or, the early model electric vehicles are folks that would view this product as something as a need versus somebody be like, oh yeah, that's kind of cool. Like it's kind of catchy and be more of a want. And so it's really kind of taking those hypotheses, then putting out, concept videos, and then helping to understand, based on other behaviors, and really honing in on like, hey, is this hypothesis right or is this hypothesis wrong? And so what we found were, those are obviously like really strong indicators, but those folks actually were not the most indicative, because a lot of those folks have already started doing home composting outdoors, right? And they're like, yeah, I've already got my process. Like I figured it out. I spent the time to, do the research and understand how to do the proper mix of, browns and greens to make sure that the compost does what it needs to do. And so it's actually more the middle ground of these folks that like really wanted to do something, but didn't have the time or didn't have the wherewithal to actually spend the energy to actually create the compost bin. And so really a lot of in-depth research, and then, constantly thinking those hypotheses and constantly testing your hypotheses with your research.
And where does the price variation come into play with that? I mean, you had basically the same product. One was selling for $300, The other one was selling for
Yeah.
3,000. When it comes to need versus want for that consumer, how did that pricing come to be, and how did you know you could sell a product for that much more?
Yeah, well, I mean, it really depends. Like, that's where you can learn a lot about brand power, right? So, like, you guys can imagine that the KitchenAid brand power and the legacy that KitchenAid has commands value. And you understand that, a consumer that has like a full-blown KitchenAid kitchen, views their kitchen as, an investment. They view it as a social gathering place, a hearth, for their home. Where somebody who has, more of an economical point of view, like they just view it as a means to an end, right? Like they don't have all of these emotional connections to like their kitchen
Right.
and what they
Keeps
build
my
and that.
food cold.
Yeah. It's more of like, yeah, it washes the dishes. And like, I wish it would be a little bit quieter because it sounds like a freight train when I'm trying to watch the TV. But like, it just needs to do its job and be done. And so it's really kind of honing in on like what drives that emotion. And if you can find something that is, attached to an emotion, like that is where you inherently can theoretically increase price quite a bit.
So Sheila, you get placed into Northern Italy now.
Yeah.
You're given this new role. Tell us about your first experiences in Northern Italy.
Yeah. So the interesting thing that I failed to mention when I first kind of previewed the role in Northern Italy was, they wanted me to go over and lead the supply chain integration. And so, thinking about it, I'm like, why would I lead the supply chain integration? Like, I get that I've done product development. I would say I had a stint in sales, and like up until leading the supply chain integration and taking this role, I would say I joke around that my only interface with supply chain or my experience was when I was in sales and I was, fresh out of business school. I joined the sales team and was selling for what was a baby brand at Whirlpool called Gladiator brand. They do garage organization. Anyway, they were at the time less than a $50 million brand. And so I had to do the sales, and I landed Costco and Sam's Club for the first time for that organization. And I was about to like really blow up my numbers. And the truck that loaded up the first, shipment of goods out towards the end of the quarter actually never left the yard. And so, of course, I couldn't count that in my sales because you can't actually recognize revenue until it leaves the yard. And so I just remember being so deflated and like calling up my supply chain person and be like, how hard is it to like get the truck out of the yard? Like, I don't understand. Like, it cannot be that hard.
Right.
And so that was like my experience. And then all of a sudden now, like, here I am, I'm going to go lead the supply chain. Right. And I'm like, what are they doing? Like, why? Like, I really want to go to Italy. Like, I love the idea of living abroad and working abroad and kind of immersing myself in a new culture and adventure. But like, to lead the supply chain, like, okay, like, I'm glad you guys have confidence in me, as a leader, but like, I'll give it a go. And so, I joined with, minimal, nothing, no experience in supply chain. And here I was, in charge of a team, and our responsibility was basically to take the Whirlpool supply chain and the Indesit supply chain and create a new supply chain that would kind of suffice for this new business with the acquisition. And so, very early on, like my goal was like, how do I just add value, right? Like, all I need to do is like, I have experts on my team from both Indesit and Whirlpool, both of these combined teams, and I just need to figure out how to add value. And so the very first thing I did was I realized that when they would have meetings, nobody was actually taking notes and nobody was actually doing any follow-up. And so we were actually super inefficient, right? You can imagine you have a meeting, everybody agrees, everybody departs. You meet again the next time, and like the first half of the meeting is spent rehashing the same exact stuff that you did the last half of the last meeting, and now you've already burnt all this time. And so I was like, you know what? I'm just going to take notes, and I'm going to go in between meetings and follow up with everybody individually. And so literally, we'd have these questions about supply chain, and I'd be like, okay, well, we talked about this. And then I had this incredible opportunity to go and meet with all of these experts one-on-one and say like, hey, like, it's really interesting. Like, I have this in my notes, and like, you mentioned that, if we did this, that it would cause a problem. Like, help me understand, like, why would that cause a problem? I don't really know. And so like over time, just by taking notes and follow up, not only did I add value, because the next time when we came into the meeting, we had an update of like, here's all the things that were, that were done since the last meeting. but I just was able to, get basically teaching one-on-one from all of these experts to actually go and do the job and help them be successful. And so, from just, asking really basic questions on like, why would you do this? Or why would you do that? Was able to garner a lot of information that helped me be successful in that role.
Well, I think it was, good on the person who hired you, right? They recognize someone who is a great listener. And that trait seems to really manifest itself within your meetings, within your organization, for your customers. What were some of the things that Whirlpool was doing different than Innocent, and Innocent was doing different than Whirlpool when it came to their manufacturing and getting the product to their customers?
Yeah, great question. And so one of the things with the two different supply chains is they had two completely different philosophies. So Whirlpool had what they call a downstream philosophy. So basically, all of the countries in Europe, they would place their orders for, how many goods they thought they were going to sell that month. The factory produced them and then immediately shipped them out to the place that put them in order. So you think about, we had factories like all through Europe, but a lot in Poland, a lot in Italy, some in France. And so you can imagine, these goods, if Belgium orders or the UK orders, they get produced and immediately sent there. Now, Indesit was the exact opposite, and they had what they call an upstream model. And so Indesit would actually hold the goods. They would collect the orders from everybody, but then they would hold them at a central warehouse location, and they would only disperse them when the actual order came in. And then if they had more orders than what was forecasted, they would disperse them in kind of a profitability or importance. And so they were a lot more strategic on how they actually delivered the goods and who would get what when it came time for when you had more, demand than you had actual supply. And so you had these two completely different philosophies sitting at the table, me with no supply chain experience saying like, okay, like we have to figure this out, right? And so, one of the first steps was obviously understanding what factories were going to stay. Once we had that kind of, footprint, we then could start planning all of the outbound shipments. And so I just asked really basic questions that you'd ask, when you're developing product, right? And so you say, okay, like you have this downstream and you have this upstream, like what are the benefits of either, right? And so like downstream, the team was like, oh, well, the supplies are, right there on site. And so if a customer asked for them, we could have turnaround within, 24 hours and have the goods at site. Where the upstream team is like, yeah, but if they're already down site and they misorder and now you've got stock that's stuck there because they couldn't sell it, like then you got to pay to have it come back. Or if you don't have it leave here, you could optimize for profitability. And then I would ask other questions like similar. I mean, just like really basic questions like, okay, like that's great. Like I'd start to see some of the benefits. Like what do our customers care about? Like, do the customers care that, they have stock nearby and they could get it within 24 hours? Like, are they willing to pay more for that benefit, or is that just something that they like? And then you would ask even further questions on like, do the customers in Switzerland, are they different than the customers in France? Like, can we have two different models, or do they all have to be served in the same way? Like, is it one or the other? And so like really basic questions ended up leading to really profound discussions among our team and like how we would actually build the supply chain, for the future of Whirlpool.
And what was the main goal there? Was it to just achieve economies of scale? Was it to just continue to grow? What was going to be our highest margins? Like what was the ultimate goal, and what did you come up with?
Yeah, so I mean, the ultimate goal was really to deliver a supply chain that one, obviously had a lot of efficiencies from two separate supply chains, right? You're serving very similar customers with very similar product, and so of course, with many acquisitions, you expect to get some efficiencies in the business between the two. But then two, really set ourselves apart from the competition, right? And understand what is it exactly that the customer wants? What are they, expecting from a service level? And then are they willing to pay for that, and make sure that we can deliver that as efficiently as possible? And so what we ended up finding was that, probably not surprising to most folks on here, is that like it ended up being a hybrid of both models, and really determined on, again, if you think back to like my whole story on all the different brands, really determined on like, what is it that customer wanted? And it turns out like some customers want that, 24-hour experience, or maybe the market dictated it. In some cases, like Switzerland, for example, is a really wealthy market in Europe. They have a lot more percentage of a higher end product. And so like when customers come in and they order, like that customer or that customer of Whirlpool or the store that they go to is expected to turn it. And so if you don't have a warehouse in Switzerland, like you're just not going to be competitive because you'll always be out of stock because those folks are expected to get it, installed the next day. And so, it's a mix of, competitive pressure as well as what the customer of Whirlpool is willing to pay, and if they're even storing stuff on their premises as well.
So Sheila, this is it's very interesting. It's a very interesting career path that you had, and I want to bring us now to where you are currently. And
Yeah.
it seems like you kind of had this early onset and experience of entrepreneurship. You go into engineering, you dabble with entrepreneurship again, entrepreneurship, operations, manufacturing, customer experiences, products, marketing, sales. But now it goes back to the language of business with financing and accounting. What have you learned with TeamSense when it comes to making strategic decisions for how to grow your company? And how did you first get the financing to get TeamSense off the ground?
Yeah, great question. So I think, what did I learn is like, again, the common thread through all of my stories is really being able to listen to the customer, and not necessarily in the exact words that to say, but like, what do they really mean, when you're asking their questions, and really ask, like basic thoughtful questions on, what is it that's their pain point and what do they really care about, related to that pain point. And that's really how, TeamSense came to be, and like how TeamSense has actually grown quite well. And so if I step back, like TeamSense started off as a COVID symptom tracking solution, specifically for manufacturing workers. We knew when the pandemic hit that, this worker population would be, disproportionately impacted, right? Like they can't come and work at a desk like you and I are so fortunate enough to do every single day. Like their job is on site, on the line. And the unique aspect that I know from, my experience and working with manufacturers are these folks don't have access to a computer. They don't have corporate email addresses. They don't want a company sponsored app on their personal phone. And so all of these things kind of combined made it really, really hard for them to get back to work safely when everybody was coming out and producing those, tracking apps or GPS this or GPS that. This population just didn't want it.
Right.
And so we kind of had this vision of, hey, I think that one is we can create an app-free solution that helps them get back to work. But two is that this worker is going to be disrupted, for a long period of time. If you think about like the way that they're trained, everybody is brought into a single room and they go through, the standard OSHA training. The way that they're communicated is via daily stand-ups, face-to-face, or, really large-scale town halls. And so like all of these elements we could see kind of looking forward a little bit were going to be, just disrupted in the long term. And so we actually built TeamSense with this idea of, hey, we could go to market as a COVID symptom tracking solution and for sure could do that. But with the same technology core, we can accomplish a lot of other workflows as well. And so we were prepared to pivot and kind of take off that go-to-market jacket of a COVID symptom tracking solution and put on, our next jacket of, right now we do absence management, we do, employee on-demand portals to give them access to resources and information, all via text and an app-free solution.
Hey, I should have asked you what TeamSense actually does first. Sorry.
No problem.
And for sake of time now, Sheila, just quickly, let's talk about a little bit about what you've learned from the financial aspects. How'd you get the funding? What are some things about how you view business and launching a new concept or product versus when you, let's say, were at Notre Dame?
Yeah, so from similar to the experience at Notre Dame and even at Whirlpool, like getting the funding is really just putting together a series of logical arguments that makes sense, right? And so trying to get somebody to follow along and saying like, okay, like, do you or do you not believe that this worker population needs to get back to work? Yes. Okay. Everybody agrees that. Great. Perfect. We're all on the same page. Like, do you then believe that my hypothesis that they're not going to be willing to accept these app solutions that Apple's making, Google's making, Microsoft's making, everybody else? And so then they're like, okay, well, maybe like help me understand. So you might have some pieces of data that help them understand to say like, you know what, we researched and, just even like it could be as few as 10 or as many as 100, folks being like, nope, don't want an app. but start to pull some data in to help, bolster your next argument. So now if you have, this population's disrupted and that they're not willing to download an app, and we know that they need a solution that needs to get back to work, then the next thing is like, okay, like, does this team have the ability to make a solution, right? And so you could have a quick demo that, you didn't invest that much in, that helps kind of, bring them along the next step in logical argument. Then of course is, how big is this addressable market? And in our case, in TeamSense, we look at hourly workers and serving the folks that don't work at desks. And then if you think about hourly workers in general, you've got a portion that work in manufacturing, you've got a portion that work in construction and logistics, and then you've got a portion in hospitality, and then even in like food service and retail. And so there's some differences among these hourly workers. You can't just treat them all the same. And so the next thing is really kind of target your market. And so in our case, we knew that, retail, food service, they have completely different needs than those of manufacturing. So then you focus in on manufacturing, understand what that market size is, and then you could put together a basic go-to-market of like, hey, this is how many people I think I can sell. This is what we need to build. And you start small, right? And so our first investment was, just a couple $100,000 to prove it out and get a proof of concept. And we were really fortunate in TeamSense in that we had our first paying customer. We got our funding May 18th and had signed our first paying customer June 1st. And I actually didn't make them pay until the end of June because our product was such an MVP that I was like, yeah, I can't like like with all of my nature, like ask you to pay based on the MVP that we delivered. Right. But by then, behind the scenes, we were pulling together as quickly as we could. And by the end of the month, we had something that was worthwhile. And we had already signed our second customer and we were off and running.
And this is the $100,000. This is equity. This is an investment. This is not a loan.
Yeah. So it was an equity investment. So they took a portion of TeamSense equity in return for the investment.
And then you were able to prove this product. You were able to get the minimum viable product out there. Yeah. What is the current state of TeamSense?
Yeah. So now we've got, tens of thousands of end users. We sell to, large scale manufacturing. I would say our sweet spot is folks that have over 1,000 end users. We do serve folks that are less than that. And basically we sit on top of the existing infrastructure and provide the glue that connects all of the hourly workers back to their companies.
Incredible. Sheila, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. I mean, going from the pinball machine all the way to now where TeamSense is, it's an incredible journey. You're a well-rounded leader. That's why we wanted to have you on the show here today. Very unique, and I hope, and wish you the best of luck, with TeamSense. Let's bring this home, Sheila. What is your definition of a real leader?
Yeah, my definition of a real leader is someone that's not afraid to try something new, hire a team, regardless of whether you're the expert or not, and just figure out a way to remove barriers and help them succeed.
Love it. For Sheila Stafford, I'm Kevin Edwards, asking you to go out there, remove barriers, and always, folks, keep it real. Thanks, Sheila.
Thank you.